everybody, and welcome back to the Death Row History Channel. I am your host, Mr. Toad. And tonight we will start part 1 of our 4-part series on botched executions. Yes, there's 4 parts, and I've got a surprise for y'all in the last video. But before we start, I want to give a shout out to Death Row Executions. After the last video dropped, Air put up a post on her page asking people what they thought, what method of execution they thought had the highest botch rate. And unsurprisingly, people thought it was the electric chair. Now, if you have watched my video, the answer is in the video. And that method is the subject of tonight's video. But we will cover, I will say this now, the executions I cover tonight are not the major executions. Not the major botched executions. These will be run-of-the-mill botched executions that happen almost daily. Well, not daily, but they happen quite regularly. And for that reason, I decided to go the mundane route to prove the point that these are not things that, these are not what the media portray them as. Every time a major botched execution happens, the media jumps all over it like piranha on a fresh steak. But botched executions are so common that it's not funny. And as I said, folks, remember, we will be going from 1982 until 2018. And there will be some surprising people on this that are covered here. And then there will be some that you have no clue who they are. Now, this will be, I will give normally I give a warning before my videos that say, if you all have a weak constitution, watch in segments. Tonight is not one of those because compared to the electric chair and gas chamber, lethal injection botched executions are a lot less gruesome. The first person that we will be talking about is Mr. Raymond Landry. Raymond Landry was put to death in December of 1988. Now, what makes Mr. Landry's execution very interesting is he was pronounced dead 40 minutes after the execution started. Now, 24 minutes into the execution, the drugs stopped. They just didn't work. They just quit working. The needle come out of his arm. And that is a common problem. I've heard it with another execution in Texas but that was at the beginning, before they even started the execution, the needle come out, and the guy looked at the officer and said, "Hey, it come out." It happens. It's called a blowout. If you're in the medical community, you know what a blowout is. And it, again, very common occurrence, but the warden Witnesses reported at least one groan as the execution team reinserted the catheter into his vein. There was the spokesman for the TDC, or TDCJ now, said there was something of a delay in the execution because of what officials called a blowout. The syringe came out of the vein, and the warden ordered them to put it back in. That's how these things work. You're not going to get off that easy. But it's interesting to note that was happening back in 1988. Now, mind you, Texas started using lethal injection in 1984, I believe. So from 1984 to 1988, there was one botched execution in Texas. The next one will be Mr. Ray Rector. Now, Ray Rector was executed in January of 1992. Mr. Rector, there was an interesting component to his case, which would lead to the argument that he was not mentally competent enough to be executed. The courts would later throw that out. Now, why was he not competent? Because when Mr. Rector turned himself into the police, he attempted suicide, and the trajectory of the bullet essentially caused a frontal lobotomy. There you go, folks. But Mr. Rector would go to trial, get convicted, and be sentenced to death in the state of Arkansas. And it took the medical staff more than 50 minutes to find a suitable vein in Mr. Rector's arm. It says witnesses were kept behind a drawn curtain and not permitted to view this scene. Now, that is SOP. Generally speaking, when they're putting the needle in the vein, or when they're strapping them into the electric chair, or when they're strapping them into the gas chamber, the witnesses don't see that because they don't need to see that. They're there to watch the person die. They're not there to watch them do what they do beforehand. But Mr. Rector let out 8 loud groans throughout the process. Now, the reason why is because they started with 2 medical personnel. So they had 2 medical personnel trying to find a vein on Mr. Rector at first. Well, 2 medical personnel couldn't find a vein, so the great state of Arkansas had the brilliant idea, let's try 5. So by the time they finally found a vein to put Mr. Rector to death, he had 5 people working on him. Overkill if you ask me, but I'm just one man. So, Mr. Rector would ultimately, the sentence would be carried out. Why they would later say that his regular use of antipsychotic medications from the lobotomy and his size, because Mr. Rector was not a small guy, were the contributing factors to the length of time that it took to find a vein. Whatever you want, whatever helps you sleep at night. I can see it, but at the same time, I honestly feel like they were just trying to cover their own asses with that one. CYA is a real thing, people. In May of 1994, the next person on the chopping block was executed by the state of Illinois in May of 1994. And for those of you that are true crime junkies, like myself, or for those of you who have any recollection of popular culture, then you know the person I'm about to name. I won't speak on his crimes because, as I said, in the world of true crime, he's a rock star. This gentleman is John Wayne Gacy. Yes, folks, Pogo the Clown was a botched execution. Although with last words like, kiss my ass, what can you do? But Mr. Gacy's execution was different than everybody else on the list. And the reason why is because the drugs solidified in the line on the IV. Well, the drugs would solidify if there was air in the line, which normally when you put an IV in, you check to make sure there's not air in the line. Well, due to the incompetence of the executioners in Illinois, because they had never done an execution before, they didn't check the line. There was air in the line. The drugs solidified, creating a blockage, so therefore the chemicals could not go through. So they went in, they had to change the line, put a fresh line in, and the second time it worked. But still it was a botched execution because it took longer than it should have. They were quoted as saying, an anesthesiologist after the fact blamed the problem on the inexperience of prison officials who were conducting the execution. He also said that proper procedures taught in IV 101 would have remedied the problem. And the next one is Mr. Emmett Foster. Emmett Foster would be executed in May of 95 by the state of Missouri. Mr. Foster provides a interesting take on the reason for a botched execution, because 7 minutes after the chemicals began to flow, the execution was halted. Why were they halted? Because the chemicals quit circulating. He's laying there on the gurney, gasping and convulsing. The blinds were drawn, so the witnesses couldn't see what they were about to have to do. Again, SOP. And death was pronounced about 30 minutes later. 30 minutes after the execution began, and 3 minutes later the blinds were reopened so the witnesses could view the corpse. According to William Gum, the Washington County coroner who pronounced the death, the problem was caused by the tightness of the leather straps that bound Foster to the gurney. So the straps they used to hold him to the gurney were too tight, and it cut off the line, and that caused the issue. It was so tight that the flow of chemicals into the veins was restricted. It said that Foster did not die until minutes later. Until several minutes later after a prison worker finally loosened the straps. So, they loosen the straps, the chemicals go in the veins, you have a dead inmate, folks. That's just how that works. I bet you they didn't tighten them. I bet you they didn't tighten them the next time. The next person on the list is a interesting case, and one that, again, if you watch Death Row Executions, you know this case because she's covered this on her channel. And she mentioned that it was a botched execution. But my job is to explain why it was botched. And the person is Christina Marie Riggs from the great state of Arkansas. She was executed in May of 2000. May must be a busy month for the execution chamber. Miss Riggs, the interesting thing is, she dropped her appeals and asked to be executed. So she asked to be put at the front of the line. However, the execution was delayed. When the time came, the execution was delayed for 18 minutes because they could not find a vein in her elbow. Again, folks, a botched execution does not mean a technical problem. They couldn't find a vein in her elbow, so they asked her if they could use her wrist. She obliged. So they put the IV in her wrist and executed her. And there you have it, folks. There is 4 botched executions, run-of-the-mill executions, that happen quite often. You have blowouts, you have solidifying of the chemicals in the line, you have the restriction of the line, and you have the changed placement of the needle. 4 things that are very common. The reason why lethal injection is so botched is because it is science. And a lot of states do not use medical professionals. Some do, some don't. They normally have a paramedic standing by in case of emergencies or in case there's a problem. But you're using guards. You're using people in the prison who are not trained on how to do an IV. And a lot of that comes from budget restrictions. They don't have some prisons, some states don't have the budget to bring people in for the executions. But that's all I have for you. This is Mr. Toad with the Death Row History Channel saying, I hope you're all doing well, and I'm gone.